For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Tabi Madiba, University of the Witwatersrand Honorary Professor in Sociology. Roger Southall joins me to discuss his co-edited book titled Election 2019, Change and Stability in South Africa's Democracy. How well managed could you say the 2019 national and provincial elections were?
On the whole, the elections were reasonably well managed, but I think the conclusion was at the end of the election they hadn't been as well managed as the previous elections, in that there were some problems at some of the voting stations, and there weren't enough materials at some of the voting stations, so there were queues and waits, and there was some suspicion of double voting, and that was investigated by Stat South Africa, who concluded it was not a really significant issue, but nonetheless it did flag, I think, growing concerns about the IEC's capacity to manage the elections. So overall, I would say, whereas previous elections you would give it a score of certainly in the high 90s. I think this time round we're probably looking at that in the high 80s. So yeah, there has been something of a deterioration, but I mean, there's nothing which can't be put wrong.
Smaller political parties staged a dramatic protest inside the Electoral Commission of South Africa National Results Centre in Pretoria, raising a number of grievances against the electoral body and media coverage in general. Do you think the coverage of the 2019 elections was personally driven?
I think the coverage of the election was, I think, perfectly fine. I think the protest by the small parties, really, I think somebody said the loudness of their objections were inverse proportion to the amount of votes they got. And I think that's very true. I think essentially a lot of them had overestimated their capacity to make an impact. For instance, Blackland First, and it just didn't happen. And so it's very easy to run and say there's a lot of problems with the way the elections were conducted. But I think on the whole, again, they got a lot of attention when they did make their protest, as is correct. But I think we know that subsequent investigation has proved their objections were actually false. And I don't think they really have a lot to worry about or object about.
In the May 8th election, electoral support for the ruling party declined even further to below 60%. What are some of the reasons you think led to this?
Well, I think that's fairly straightforward in the sense that we had come out of the Zuma period. And during that period, there are a number of things, of course. The economy has been immensely troubled, and the indicators of that are worsening unemployment, serious problems about productivity, declining incomes for most people, and on the whole, the outlook of the economy has been worsened during that Zuma period. And there was huge attention given to the amount of corruption which seemed to be going on under the President Zuma. So when eventually Zuma was replaced, it came as a major relief to the country. And of course, Cyril Ramaphosa he rode in on a white charger really, saying, I'm the man to lift South Africa out of the mire. And I think it was termed Ramaphoria, the effect which his immediate appearance had. And I think it's rather significant because it immediately charged the ANC campaign. There had been some considerable fear, if not expectation, in the high ranks of the ANC in some quarters that had they gone into the election with Zuma's former wife at the head of the operation, then they might well have been forced into a coalition because they wouldn't have got 50% of the vote. But I think many people in the ANC were correct in saying that Cyril Ramaphosa's appearance at the head of the ANC meant that nationally they did a lot better than they might otherwise have expected to. And in many ways, many people would say they did much better than they deserved to do, because really their record over the last 5-10 years was really one of poor governance. So I think that the ANC's performance was remarkably good given the circumstances of the country and the record which the ANC had behind it. And there's one other factor too, in that there was a definite Cyril Ramaphosa effect, in that there was a segment of vote which would have gone to the DA normally, but because they saw the possibility of Ramaphosa coming in and clearing up the mess left by the Zuma administration, that at national level some people shifted from the DA to the ANC so as to make sure that Ramaphosa got in.
And everyone has been going on about how President Cyril Ramaphosa can save the ANC. In fact, Ramaphosa produced the worst general election results the ANC has ever had, losing 19 seats in the process. Do you think Ramaphosa can really save the ANC?
As I think I've just said, if Ramaphosa had not appeared, I think the ANC would have done a lot worse than it did do. And I think that he can claim major credit for that. I think he gave the country a sudden surge of hope that the downward trajectory which we'd seen for the last 10 years was not necessarily going to continue, that there could be some serious attention to economic reform, that the troubles of the state-owned enterprises could be properly attended to, and the mounting debt of the country could actually be limited and could be dealt with. And I think that is all down to the particular effect of Ramaphosa winning the leadership. Of course, there was a lot of criticisms after he won the leadership. A lot of criticisms that he had been part of the Zuma administration since, 2013 or something, or no, 2014. But then he was given the benefit of the doubt. People said, well, his possibilities of objecting while he was deputy president were limited. So he was given the benefit of the doubt. So yes, I think it was the worst result the ANC has experienced. And I think the ANC needs to look very carefully at what it's going to do to correct that. But it can't be blamed on the leadership at the moment. Next time round, maybe the story will be different.
A loss of 5 seats in Parliament has been presented as a calamity, with predictions of DA leader Mmusi Maimane being removed as a leader. Do you think issues such as black economic empowerment and the expropriation of land without compensation alienated both black and white voters?
I think it's probably correct to say that it did. I think that expropriation of land without compensation was hailed by the ANC as something of a vote winner and a way of circumventing the appeal of the EFF. But I think there were a lot of critical voices when it was passed, and they weren't completely all coming from the white community. I think a lot of black people in the ANC recognised the dangers this could bring to in terms of slowing up foreign investment. And I think Cyril Ramaphosa himself was in many ways tried to circumscribe the passage of expropriation of land without compensation by emphasising in international and national arenas that it would be limited to certain cases, that there would be compensation would be fair, and it would not be the standard mode. Now, in terms of the DA, of course, that takes us into the issues with the DA and the criticisms of Maimane. Now, I've mentioned that Ramaphosa, I don't think, could be blamed for the loss in support for the ANC. There's much more questions around Mmusi Maimane. Not because he did anything particularly wrong, but perhaps he didn't do enough right. in that he hasn't got a particularly strong image, I think, as a political leader, and he finds it difficult to present himself, and I don't think there is that sense of popular trust in him as an alternative leader, which opposition parties really need. And it is difficult for opposition parties. Look at the way that Jeremy Corbyn has suffered in Britain, faced by a hostile press. Musi Maimani has not had a hostile press in the same way, but of course he has had divisions within the DA itself. And certainly, again, I think where he cannot be blamed completely is that the fights within the DA were not always of his own making. The whole mess around Patricia de Lille in Cape Town was a disaster for the party, and that tended to alienate, broadly speaking, coloured people in the Western Cape. And certainly around issues of black economic empowerment, there was a certain lobby in the DA which said, no, we don't want anything to do with this, we can't have that sort of ANC light policy in our party, we've got to stick to our liberal policies. So now the DA is still having to work out those problems, and we don't know whether they're going to be able to manage it. So I think it's a crisis for the DA.
The economic freedom fighters did very well to gain a 10% of the vote nationally, being the official opposition in 3 provinces, namely Mpumalanga, Northwest and Limpopo. Does this guarantee more support in the coming elections?
I think it's very possible that in the local government elections coming up that the EFF will increase its vote and do quite handsomely. And that's partly because it's going to be a reflection of the rather lacklustre performance of the ANC since the election and the divisions within the DA. But in terms of the last election, I think we have to be cautious in interpreting the EFF vote. Again, I think the EFF did not do as well as it had hoped and expected. It was talking about getting 12-15% and it got 10%. And we also know that its support is fairly spotty. It made some progress around the country, particularly in KwaZulu-Natal, but generally a lot of its support was still very clustered in urban areas and in the 3 provinces you mentioned. And the other issue is that we do know that it has a very strong gender dimension. There is much more young and male support than there is from females. They do have, if I can put it like this, a woman problem, in the sense that they come over as pretty patriarchal in some of the things they say and in the behaviour of some of the leadership. And unless they solve that, that's going to be a problem. And meanwhile, they had the thickest and the heaviest party manifesto, but some of their policies seem, frankly, to be unworkable. And I think that people see them still as a party of protest, not potentially as a party of government.
EFF leader Julius Malema and Deputy President Floyd Chivambu have been implicated in using funds looted at VBS Mutual Bank, which is the money representing the life savings and retirement of ordinary South Africans, especially that of thousands of inhabitants of the Limpopo province, poverty-stricken rural areas. These are the very people the EFF claim to represent. What is your intake on this issue?
Well, I think the more this story rolls on, the more revelations we get. And of course, it's not restricted to the EFF. It also involves a lot of ANC politicians. But the EFF has put itself in this particular position, claiming to be holier than thou and to be the strongest representative of the poor. And of course, then if the leadership is revealed as essentially taking money away from poor people, they're going to have a serious image problem. And I think it may turn a lot of people who the EFF might otherwise hope to appeal to, it's going to turn them away from the party. And the problem is, as with so many politicians, not just in this country but elsewhere, look at Donald Trump for instance, they are in denial. Anything comes up, they just simply deny it and they use lies, and people end up not believing them. And I think that Julius Malema is going to hit that problem in terms of trying to expand the vote of the EFF.
The Freedom Front Plus doubled its support of a low base and powered up to number 5 out of 14 parties represented in the National Assembly. Was this a benefit from the DA's loss?
Yes, I think essentially, as we were mentioning a few minutes ago, the DA is in crisis mode. And I think that in many ways the Freedom Front Plus was giving dog whistles, really I think to Afrikaans-speaking people saying come home. And they were doing, if you like, appealing to former National Party supporters to come to an ethnic homeland, essentially. Which is not to say they're not raising real issues. Of course, they were quite vocal in terms of talking about the safety of whites and white farmers and so on and so forth, which may be very real issues, and they certainly appeal to a segment of the population. But I think, yes, I think where they scored was in the divisions within the DA, and I think the lack of a clear programme from the DA. And the DA is going to have to work hard to win those supporters back. If it tries too hard to win that sort of voter back, it may alienate black voters. And the only way for an opposition party in this country to seriously expand is, of course, by eating into the ANC's overwhelmingly black vote. So it goes back to the DA's problems and how we actually develop an opposition in this country which can take on the ANC.
And lastly, what do you think we can expect in the next election going off the 2019 election?
In the next general election? Well, I think that's a very open question at this point, because I think it really depends on the success which Cyril Ramaphosa will have in steering the economy to something of a better future. It will depend on the success which the government enjoys in trying to clean up the SOEs and put them in a path to recovery, and in dealing with national debt. And of course, we are moving into a crisis in that regard, and if we lose our rating, I think it's Moody's, in the next month or so, then our international debt repayments will increase and there'll be less for government's programme. So we are in a major crisis, and the government has got to try to deal with it. I think people are fairly sensible. Our voters are not stupid. They will give the government credit if it does manage to make an improvement in the economy. But all the while, there is still a major crisis, major social crisis in this country. And something we haven't talked about, if I may, is the fact that a lot of people voted in this election, but increasingly a lot of people did not vote in this election. And it would seem that a larger segment of the South African population is saying these elections are not for me, I'm not going to vote for any political party, it's not going to do anything for me, and I'm turning off, and I'm going to put my energies into some other form of protest or opposition. And I think that is dangerous, and I think the political parties need to address that very seriously. Our democracy was very hard won, but these things can be very easily lost. And if we lose the interest and involvement of people in our electoral process, then it will open them up to mobilization by popular forces which may be anti-democratic. We've seen it in other countries, and it can happen here. So I think that is perhaps something we should be really worrying about ahead of the next election.
That was Roger Southall speaking to Creamer Media's Polity about election 2019, change and stability in South Africa's democracy.